On June 15th, 1904, the PS General Slocum went on a day trip down the East River. The boat was filled with mostly German immigrant families who had spent what little extra money they had to enjoy a relaxing day together. Sadly, their day of relaxation would turn into a day of terror as the General Slocum caught fire. When the entire ordeal was over 1,000 people were dead, out of the original 1,300 on board. So, how did this happen? I wanted to find out, so I learned about the General Slocum disaster. I had never heard of the General Slocum disaster. I just started Googling around for topics and found it by literally searching early 20th century US disasters. I know it's a weird thing to Google, but I needed a topic. What caught my eye is that this was not only the worst maritime disaster in New York history, but it was also the deadliest New York City event until 9/11. When it was launched in 1891, Slocum was considered to be the height of luxury for a New York City steamboat. It was the boat that demanded top dollar for travel. I mean, travel consisted of going around New York area, but still. However, by 1904, it was no longer considered the height of luxury and had begun catering to the middle class. This means that on the morning of June 15th, 1904, the Slocum was filling up with middle class patrons. The group mainly consisted of the immigrant German community because St. Mark's Evangelical Lutheran Church, located in Little Germany in New York, decided to make this voyage a parish event. This also means the boat was filling up with families. There were many small children and babies on board. This pleasant day trip turned ugly when, for some reason, a fire started. I say it that way because no one knows why it started. To quote historian Edward O'Donnell, its exact origin will never be known. Most likely, it originated with a match or a cigarette carelessly tossed by a crewman, but it may have come from a lamp accidentally overturned by the roll of the vessel, or a spark from an overhead wire. In the end, all that mattered was that somewhere in the lamp room, below the main deck of the General Slocum, a particle of fire had found a home. For anyone unfamiliar, fire may be one of the worst things you can have on a boat. Actually, one of the worst things you can have anywhere. The fire originally started small in a sealed room where it was eating away at the oxygen. It wasn't good, but it wasn't the end of the world. It was manageable. However, deckhand John Coakley was alerted to the fire by a young boy who said he had seen smoke. Coakley made the disastrous decision to throw open the door to the lamp room, introducing a new source of air that quickly revived the fire. Now, instead of a stationary dying flame, there was a growing inferno launching onto nearby flammable materials such as kerosene and dry hay. You know, if I had a room full of the most flammable material possible, I would have someone watching it with the ability to put out any flame quickly. That's just me. Coakley made the whole thing worse by leaving the door open, which means he essentially provided the fire with a constant supply of oxygen, the thing that helps fire grow. Coakley may not have made these mistakes had the Slocum had any fire training, but no one can remember any fire drills ever being performed. The ship's crew, including First Mate Ed Flanagan and Chief Engineer Conklin, tried to put out the fire. However, the hose kinked during unfurling, and the back pressure caused leaks throughout the hose. Why did the pressure break the hose so easily? Because the hose was originally purchased in 1891 and was cheap unlined linen. It had rotted away by 1904. With fresh oxygen growing in the fire and no water to put it out, the Slocum was essentially doomed. When the ship's captain, William Van Schaik, realized the reports of the fire were real and not a prank by some darn kids, he had to decide what to do. Did he try to turn around? Did he try to run the boat into the nearest landmass he could find? Or should he make for North Brother Island? North Brother Island would be the ideal choice as the water was deep, allowing the ship to get closer to the beach. However, it was a mile up the river and would require going full speed into the wind. Personally, I have no idea which option was best. I've never been captain of a boat. No one would ever trust me to do that. Van Schaik decided the North Brother Island was the right course of action. The choice to go to the North Brother had two devastating effects for the Slocum and its passengers. First, the wind helped expand the fire even more. Had they pulled over immediately, it still would have grown, but at a slower pace. Second, it meant that when other ships saw the fire and tried to help, they had to chase the Slocum instead of being able to provide instantaneous aid. It's always great when those trying to help you have to follow you. Once the passengers realized there was a fire, panic set in. There's a reason you can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. People freak out. In the minds of the passengers, they had two options. One, put on life preservers and jump, or two, get to a lifeboat. However, in reality, they only had the first option. The six lifeboats aboard the Slocum would have been enough to save about 200 people, so not even close enough to the amount on board. However, they were literally wired to the deck and unmovable. O'Donnell believes that at some point, someone got annoyed with the lifeboats rattling around and wired them down. To use the age-old insult, smooth move, X-Lax. This left the passengers with the only option of grabbing a life preserver and jumping. Life preservers were critical because most did not know how to swim. Of course, life preservers are only valuable if they help you stay above water. The life preservers on the Slocum were old, having never been replaced, and instead of helping passengers float, they acted like a weight pulling people under. There are numerous stories of parents putting life preservers on their children and tossing them overboard, only to never see their child reemerge. I can't imagine how awful those parents felt in those moments. Most of the time, those parents follow the children with the same problem. In the trials following the disaster, the life preservers became a source of controversy. The owner of the Slocum, the Knickerbocker Steamship Company, claimed they had just recently purchased new preservers for the ship. However, it was discovered that the preservers the Knickerbocker Steamship Company claimed belonged to the Slocum were actually purchased for its sister ship, the Grand Republic. The bookkeeper for the Knickerbocker Steamship Company actually used acid to erase the Grand Republic name off the bills of sale. The changes were obvious, and one bill didn't even have it. Her story fell apart quickly. The bookkeeper didn't do this on her own accord. She was clearly told to do so by the higher-ups in the company. See, you can't trust the Knicks. The Sixers would never let you down like this. They just won't make the playoffs ever. The story of the Slocum is not about the many, many failings of the company and the crew, but about the terrible situation in which the passengers found themselves. I just covered how some passengers jumped into the water with life preservers, thinking that they could float, they either made it to shore or were rescued, only to discover the preservers quickly became waterlogged and sank. However, for those who could swim in and went without preservers, things were not much better. The water was filled with drowning people, clawing at any solid object they could find. Sadly, that object was often another person, and the water soon became a battle of passengers taking each other under. O'Donnell covers the story of the Kiesel family. Edward Kiesel swam ashore with his son, while his wife Annie made her way with the couple's daughter. Edward reached the safety of the shore, but Annie was soon attacked by a drowning man. Annie fought back, but the man managed to bring the couple's daughter underwater with him. Annie Kiesel had to watch as her daughter was torn from her arms, drowning. I can't imagine how that felt. I also don't think the man was trying to bring a kid under, hurt someone else. His mind had entered into panic survival mode, and he was grabbing at anything he could find. This is what was going on with most of the people drowning. The Kiesel story is not the only example of such events. Many survivors tell the tale of either seeing someone pulled under by those drowning or having someone torn from their grips. Of course, staying on the ship might have been worse. The fire was spreading quickly and might have seemed to be chasing the passengers. The smoke inhalation had to be awful, but nothing compared to the burns suffered by those passengers who remained on board. 15-year-old Anna Fries's father had her wait till it was almost too late to jump over the side of the ship. What she didn't realize was that the heat had melted her hand to the paint on the railing. She tore off her skin when she jumped. She had dreams of being a concert pianist before the trip. Passengers who did their best to save others. Meanwhile, there were other boats that took to the water, doing their best to pull people to safety, while avoid setting fire to their own boats, which was a concern. Finally, two heroes came from possibly one of the most unexpected places, Rikers Island. John Merther and Dan Casey were at the prison workhouse when they saw the flames. They rushed to a boat to help, which of course was a big risk. They could be accused of trying to escape. Luckily, a workhorse. Finally, two heroes came from possibly one of the most unexpected places, Rikers Island. Prisoners John Merther and Dan Casey were at the prison workhouse when they saw the flames. They rushed to a boat. Finally, two heroes came from possibly one of the most unexpected places, Rikers Island. Finally, two heroes came from possibly one of the most unexpected places, Rikers Island. Inmates John Merther and Dan Casey were at the prison workhouse when they saw the flames. They rushed to a boat to help, which of course was a big risk. They could be accused of trying to escape. Luckily, a workhouse doctor joined them and verified their story. Though the number saved by all the rescuers was low compared to those lost, it was still a group effort to save even a single soul. The story of the Slocum does not end with the complete evacuation of the ship. The many dead had to be identified, and that became its own obstacle. Some people were instantly identified on the beach because their families were with them on the boat and had survived. However, for the majority, it would take someone who was not on the Slocum to identify the body. The local morgue established a viewing area for relatives to enter so they could identify the bodies. There is no way the morbid procession of families going to identify their deceased loved ones didn't have a traumatic effect on the community. There was also a moment after the initial disaster that had to gain traction. The Monday after the Slocum disaster, hundreds of bodies began appearing in the East River. As corpses decompose, gases build up and bodies can float once again. If the stories weren't enough to convince the public how awful this event was, the sight of hundreds of floating corpses had to help and horrify. The response to the disaster was outrage. People wanted the company to be held accountable for the lives lost. President Roosevelt appointed a commission to investigate the incident. The Knickerbocker Steamship Company argued that it had passed all safety inspections, so should it be held accountable? Yes, of course, they supplied the old life preservers, locked the lifeboats to the deck, and never held a fire drill, but they passed the safety inspections. If you're wondering how they passed these safety inspections, I fully understand. I was wondering too. The inspector, Henry Lumberg, was a novice who had received only 3 weeks of training before inspecting the Slocum. Furthermore, as O'Donnell puts it, he had been trained in the fine art of looking the other way by his trainers. This would explain why Lumberg allowed the crew to hand him one of the few new life preservers to examine instead of all the old ones, and why he trusted them the water wasn't coming out of the pumps because they were turned off. It also explains why he passed the lifeboats even though they were in bad condition. Finally, it explains why he didn't even note or comment on the fact that the lamp room was filled with flammable materials, which would have been a violation. So I thought they should have had a guard outside their flammable lamp room, but it turns out they shouldn't have even had a flammable lamp room. The heads of Knickerbocker, Captain Van Schaik, First Mate Flanagan, and Inspector Lumberg were all found guilty of manslaughter in the coroner's inquest. But the coroner's inquest really means little legally speaking. Somehow, only Van Schaik was found guilty of criminal negligence in criminal court. He was sentenced to 10 years, but was eventually released on parole and later pardoned by President Taft. How was Van Schaik the only one found guilty? Well, Lumberg was tried 3 times for manslaughter and had 3 mistrials. The jury was split on whether he should be found guilty. That fourth trial was unrealistic. The Knickerbocker Steamship Company was hiding behind Lumberg's inspection. If he wasn't guilty, how could they be? So they weren't even tried. That makes no sense to me, but okay. There is no doubt in my mind that Van Schaik contributed to the disaster, not just because he kept pressing forward to North Brother Island. Honestly, he thought he was doing the right thing when he kept doing that. No, he was responsible for failing to train his crew in the fire procedures. The crew's lack of training helped the fire grow into a raging inferno. But Van Schaik should not be the only one held responsible, since honestly, he had the smallest role. The Knickerbocker Steamship Company is the biggest villain. The company is the one that didn't replace the life preservers or the fire hose. They are also the ones who left the lifeboats deteriorate. Hundreds of lives would have been saved, maybe all of them, if the hose had worked or the life preservers could actually save lives. Lundberg could have put a stop to everything if he had actually performed a proper inspection. But okay, punish only Van Schaik. That makes sense. There is a memorial to the General Slocum victims, but overall, the tragedy faded quickly from memory. The survivors and families tried to keep it in the minds of the public, but tragedies like the Titanic and the World Wars just overshadowed it. It's a real shame because the community was decimated so a company could save money, and that honestly should be remembered to help the public always be aware of what can happen. Now, truthfully, we've seen it time and time again. This is generally where I go over my sources, but I only use one book for this topic because there aren't many works on the General Slocum, and aside from the one book I read, the others were really difficult to get a hold of. Luckily, the book I used was great. Ships Ablaze, The Tragedy of Steamboat General Slocum by Edward T. O'Donnell. Since I can only have one book on this topic, I'm really glad it was this one. O'Donnell does a terrific job of not only providing the details of the disaster, but also telling the human stories. I say this as a compliment, but honestly, the book is kind of depressing. O'Donnell's telling the victim stories is so real and visceral that there are moments you just can't help but feel sad and depressed. But that's a positive. He sucks you into the story. This book provides all the necessary historical information, but it just was written for someone who wants to read a story about humanity. I would encourage anyone to read this book, not just history fanatics. But if you're watching this, you're probably a history fanatic. I also want to note that the New York Historical Museum has an excellent article about the General Slocum. It is great for someone looking for a quick, easy read and introduction to the topic. Well, second introduction. I get number one, right? Unless you knew about it. And that's all I have. Please like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff, and I will see you next time.